All right, I guess we'll get started. Welcome and thank you for joining me tonight for the virtual talk, Tundra Swans in Important Bird and Biodiversity Areas. My name is Colleen Inglis and I am the Educational Program Coordinator at Lambton Heritage Museum, which is located near Grand Bend. And I'm pleased to have you here tonight and to provide a bit of context for this presentation and to introduce our speaker. Every year about this time, the Tundra Swans return to the fields near Lambton Heritage Museum as part of their annual migration. The majestic birds never fail to draw a crowd. Many of the bird enthusiasts also visit the museum to explore our Tundra Swan exhibit and to take part in swan-related activities or March break programming. Unfortunately, this year we had to go virtual, so we decided to do something a bit different. Now, unfortunately, our speaker, Amanda Bichel, was unexpectedly unable to join us live this evening. So instead, we pre-recorded her presentation this afternoon. I'll show it here in its entirety in just a few minutes. And Amanda is the Ontario Important Bird and Biodiversity Areas Coordinator for Birds Canada. Her role focuses on coordinating the Caretaker Program, a group of on-the-ground stewards for Ontario important bird and biodiversity areas. Amanda has a background in environmental studies and biology. She has worked with birds, bats, soil, and water. She is motivated by a desire to connect people with nature and provide opportunities for future generations to experience the beauty of nature. I really enjoyed hearing from her this afternoon, and I hope you will too. She was very sorry to have to miss out on the opportunity to interact live with everyone. If this is your first time participating in a Zoom presentation, I'll just share a couple tips. You can use the chat box to socialize with other webinar attendees or to make comments. Just make sure that you have selected all attendees if you want to send a message to everyone and not just to the panelists. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the Q&A section or the chat. Although Amanda isn't here, I'll do my best to answer questions at the end. So I'll just start her presentation.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining me, and thank you, Colleen, for having me talk for the Lambton Museum. I wish I was there in person, but as we know, can't happen right now. So I'm really excited to talk to you guys about Tundra Swans and important bird and biodiversity areas in Ontario. So just a little bit about me. I'm the Ontario Important Bird and Biodiversity Areas Coordinator. I'm going to say IBA a lot, so that's what that stands for at Birds Canada. I've always loved being out in nature, and I do love being part of an organization that gives back to nature like Birds Canada. I'm kind of a new-ish birder. Medium. And I'm also getting into a little bit of bird banding. The picture in the corner is me banding a saw-whet owl a few years ago. There's so much to learn with bird banding, and I like the challenge. And oh, if you don't know what bird banding is, it's when you put a little ID on each individual bird that you catch in a mist net and let them go. And then hopefully catch them at some other point in their migration. And it helps teach us a lot about, how long they live and where they fly for migration and a lot of other good information that we can use for conservation. I really also love eBird, and I'm a super eBird and data nerd, and I could waste hours just looking at observations on eBird and iNaturalist. And if you haven't already checked those out, they're both very user-friendly, and they're a really great way to learn more about nature. And so by the end of the presentation, I'm hoping you know a little bit more about Birds Canada, a little bit more about IBAs, and lots more about swans and Tundra Swans specifically. This is just a quick picture of where the Birds Canada headquarters is. This is Long Point. This is actually in Port Rowan near Long Point. So I'm lucky enough to get to work at this beautiful spot and get to, walk the trails every day. And once it's safe, hopefully people can come visit again. So we're a non-for-profit, non-governmental charity, and our mission is to conserve wild birds through sound science, on-the-ground actions, innovative partnerships, public engagement, science-based advocacy. So basically, we do everything we can to help a diverse and passionate set of members and volunteers conserve birds and their habitat. So Birds Canada started out as LPBO, the Long Point Bird Observatory, in 1960. And it's now the oldest, most productive bird observatory in the Western Hemisphere. And in 2017, we actually banded our millionth bird, a Tennessee warbler. So in the 90s, we became Bird Studies Canada and expanded our role to engage citizens in bird conservation. And we recently updated our logo and website and name to Birds Canada to better highlight our outreach, engagement, and education work that we do. Right now, we have 50 to 75 staff members, depending on the season. And we run 40 citizen science programs, including the IBA program, Christmas bird count, feeder watch, and many more programs. So there's really something for everyone at Birds Canada. So if you want to get into birding, it doesn't matter if you're really new to it or you've been doing it for years, you should check out our website and all the programs that we have. So birds are a huge part of our landscape, and they're a really good indicator of ecosystem health and biodiversity. And also 1 in 5 Canadians enjoys bird watching. So since you're watching this, I hope I don't have to convince you to like birds, but I'll just tell you a few important things that they do. So birds distribute seeds, they pollinate plants like the hummingbird, and they control pests. They also have value as food for other species and as habitat creators like woodpeckers, creating holes in trees. Birds like the bald eagle also have important spiritual and cultural significance. And of course, millions of people just love hearing and seeing birds. In a recent Canadian nature survey, bird watchers spent an average 133 days a year birding. And in the US, in 2016, bird watchers spent an estimated $39 billion. So there's obviously also an economic benefit that birds bring us as well. So this is a graph taken from the 2019 State of Canada Bird. It really highlights why we do what we do, kind of from a optimistic and a pessimistic perspectives. So there's some great recovery examples, such as raptors and waterfowl, which are really good examples of what can happen when science and decision makers and the community all work together. There are unfortunately a lot of species in decline as well, like grassland birds and aerial insectivores. And those are the species that in Canada and globally need a voice. So that's why we do what we do. And this is just from our website. So you should check it out if you want to learn a little bit more detail on ways you can help birds. And now I'll just jump into the program that I run here in Ontario called the Important Bird and Biodiversity Area Program. So IBAs are a suite of designated sites which are part of a global program. And our main goals are to identify those sites, monitor them for population trends, and conserve them when we can, all with help from community members. IBAs are non-governmental and non-regulatory, so they aren't recognized as protected lands by law in Canada. They have a huge size range from tiny patches to huge tracts of land or water. And they're on any type of land, really, including urban, rural, private, public, and they often overlap with parks and wildlife management areas or other forms of formal protection. Unfortunately, over half of our IBAs in Canada have zero protection whatsoever. So it's just another reason to kind of care about these really important spots for birds and biodiversity. A bit about the science behind it. I won't go too deep into it, but in Canada, we use 2 criteria. So threatened species, so species at risk, and congregations of birds. So they both qualify by meeting a minimum number of birds. or a percentage of the bird population. And an example of species at risk here in Ontario is the Louisiana water thrush, which is in the picture. And it's listed under the Species at Risk Act as threatened in Canada. And there's about 10 forested IBAs in Ontario that have really good habitat for this Louisiana water thrush. And the other criteria is for congregation of birds. This is when 1% or more of the population uses a site for part of their life cycle, like for wintering, staging, or breeding. And several IBAs are designated for huge numbers of ducks and gulls and swans that depend on their habitat, including Eastern Lake St. Clair, which is kind of close to you guys. So globally, there's 12,000 sites in 200 countries, which makes IBAs the largest global network of sites for birds and biodiversity. So this includes terrestrial, freshwater, and marine sites. And this is just a quick snapshot of the 600-ish sites in Canada. They're mainly coastal sites or interior wetland sites, but there's also some forest IBAs as well. So since 2016, the IUCN has been working on key biodiversity areas. And it's a program for all biodiversity under one roof for the first time. So we're really excited about the program here in Canada and hope it can really bolster all of the amazing conservation work that's already been done at IBAs. At Birds Canada, our team has been focusing on seeing which IBAs will qualify to become KBAs. So check out this story map if you want to learn just a little bit more about the program. There's two really cool examples in the story map of candidate KBAs. And I just want to do a quick shout out to volunteers that help with the IBA and other Birds Canada programs and really any conservation programs. So this picture is the last time I visited Lambton, and Malcolm, I'm not sure if you know him, showed me around. He works on the natural environment of lands and developing environmental education programs for Scout campers. And he showed me around the Scout property, which was really nice. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight that we would really get nothing done at Birds Canada or in the IBA program without the passion and, the push from all the volunteers that work for conservation. Okay, so here's a zoomed in look at some of the IBAs in Southern Ontario, just to give you a picture of where some of them are. You're probably familiar with some of the ones close by, like the Lake St. Clair, Rondeau, and Point Pelee IBAs. And now a much more zoomed in map to one of the IBAs I'll talk about now for a bit, the Port Franks Forested Dunes IBA. So this includes the Pinery Provincial Park, Lambton County Heritage Forest, Carner Blue Sanctuary, and so many other trails, and also the Kettle Point Indian Reserve on the southwest portion. And the Lambton Heritage Museum falls within the IBA, just on the boundary, right where the star is in that picture. So the forest complex covers 45 kilometers square, and it's the largest forested area on the eastern shore of Lake Huron, south of the Bruce Peninsula. So the forest is mainly made of wooded dunes, oak and pine that extend inland from Lake Huron. And the oldest dunes, which are furthest inland, are nearly 25 meters high. So some bird species that the IBA is designated for is a little gull, the Acadian flycatcher, which is a species at risk that nests in the IBA. That's the first picture there. And there are also a number of other species at risk that depend on the forests, including eastern whippoorwill, which is that cute bird right there, and red-headed woodpeckers. So on eBird, I looked it up. There's 293 species that have been observed in the IBA, which includes rarities and vagrants. So you might not always be able to see all of them, but around 124 of them are found nesting in the forests in the IBA. So basically, the IBA is really important for breeding forest birds and also many warblers and songbirds during spring and fall migration. And of course, the area is not only important for birds, but for wildlife as a whole. because there's such a diverse set of habitats, including the forested dunes and low wet meadows. It makes the forest complex very diverse. So the area supports a huge number of provincially and nationally threatened plant and animal communities. So these include things like Ontario's only lizard, the five-line skink, snapping turtle, which is the first photo there, hence blazing star, which is the second photo, and the only observation of the rusty patch bumblebee, an endangered species in Canada, was seen in the pinery. So another thing I think important to mention here is all the conservation work that happens in the IBA. So much of the IBA does overlap with protected areas and is managed by conservation-minded groups, including the Provincial Park, First Nations, and Scouts Canada. And some conservation activities that take place in the IBA are species at risk research on the five-line skink and little brown bat, and invasive species removal, and ongoing youth education at Scouts Canada. And of course, the Tundra Swans do use the IBA as well. Not so much the forested areas, but the lake probably roost at night. And that's within the boundary of the IBA. So this bar chart shows the months along the top, and it's specifically made for the IBA boundaries. And it shows basically the timing of each species in the IBA. So the green bar also shows how common the species is at the time. So for Tundra Swans, this shows that they can be around basically from October until April, but they're much more common in February and March. And these are some high counts from all the data on eBird for the IBA. So note there's a high count of 4,000 to 5,000 swans in March. These are all observations from one checklist at a time. So the number of Tundra swans that visit in a whole season is definitely a lot bigger than that. So the high count is actually a brand new observation from March 13th, but it could be actually in the fields outside of the IBA. So we'll get to that IBA right now. So the Thetford Flats borders the Pinery Provincial Park, and it's around 10 kilometers south of Grand Bend. In the past, this area was shallow bay and marsh that was cut off from Lake Huron by the sand dunes that I mentioned in the previous IBA. And in 1875, a canal was cut through the dunes to drain the marsh. And the last lake, Lake Smith, was drained in 1959. So contrary to the Port Frank's Forested Dunes IBA, the Thetford Flats really has no overlap with formal protection. And Tundra Swans are the main trigger for this IBA. However, the presence is becoming a little bit more unpredictable due to early and extra field drainage in the IBA. Other birds in the area, swans are the only thing that triggers the IBA, but there's a lot of other cool species that can be seen in the fields, like sandhill cranes and northern harriers, which are pictured here, but also short-eared owls and other field species. There's actually 126 species that have been observed in the IBA, in and around those fields. As far as other biodiversity, I don't think there's much to talk about. There might be small patches of habitat here and there, but the IBA is mainly corn and soybean crops. So this is that same bar chart, but for the Thetford Flats IBA. And it shows that Tundra swans are relatively common from November to April. But again, they're most common in February and March during the spring migration. And do you remember the high counts for the Port Frank's Forested Dune? It was around 4,000 to 5,000. But for the Thetford Flats IBA, the high counts are a lot higher. So there's around 33,000 that have been seen in one day. So one person counted 33,000 in the fields outside of the Lambton Museum, which is pretty cool. Again, the number of swans actually migrating through for the whole season is likely much, much larger. So the count of 33,000 was made last year, and it's around 11% of its global population. So it's just a huge number that travel through this IBA and stop over and fatten up on the way to their breeding grounds. So it's super important for them. So even though, we have some pretty good numbers of swans in the fields, it could always be better. So if you ever want to do a count, or you're interested in learning how to do a coordinated count, please contact me and I can help you get started. Okay, now I'm going to go over some Swan ID. And my first tip is that don't let this trick you. This is not really a swan. It's a man in a swan blind taking pictures of swans. And this is also not a swan. This is Swami Swan from the Lorax, if anyone's read that. Okay, so I'm going to get into actual ID now. This beautiful swan is called a mute swan. It's really easy to ID because it is the only swan here with a bright orange beak. In this photo, it's kind of raising its wings slightly, which is the beginning of a threat display called busking. So both males, which are called cobs, and females, which are called pens for all swans, do this. But the male's display is much more intense, and it's usually to ward off other males as well as predators. The mute swan is one of 3 introduced species that are protected under the Migratory Convention Act, Birds Convention Act, and were brought in from Europe as an ornamental addition to parks and estates. Unfortunately, these huge birds have established breeding populations, and they do pose a threat to native waterfowl because they're pretty aggressive and they have really huge appetites. So one study found that they eat up to 8 pounds of aquatic vegetation every day. So this often disturbs local ecosystems and even can pose a threat to humans. So a really kind of interesting fact about the mute swan is that when swan masters, which were people who kept swans, they would permanently scar their bills in really distinct patterns, so that if the swans got stolen, which did happen often, you could tell by looking at the beaks which estate they belong to. So here's a picture of some of those scarrings that they did. So they would put these on them, and if you read the text, one of the oldest ones is in the 1300s, which is pretty cool. Just a kind of neat aside there. So this is the purple areas here are established breeding populations that I mentioned of mute swans. However, there are many other records all over North America, and this can kind of become an issue for habitats and native species if breeding populations are kind of left unchecked, as they're kind of hard to tell apart from the ornamental populations. All right, next swan. This is a trumpeter swan. It's the largest native swan in Canada, and it has an all-black bill that is really straight and long. And I'm going to compare it later with the Tundra Swan head, so I'll kind of leave it at that for now for ID. But trumpeter swans are really large. The males are over 26 pounds, which makes them North America's heaviest flying bird. So that's heavier than a car tire. So imagine trying to get a car tire to fly. So because of this, trumpeter swans need at least 100-meter long stretch of open water to act kind of like a runway to take off to fly. They can also look exactly like this, but a very rusty head because they forage in iron-rich water, and it kind of dyes their head. I've seen very red pictures of their heads. Right now, trumpeter swan populations are making a comeback in North America. In the early 1900s, there was a lot of pressure from hunting their skins and their feathers, that in around 1935, it was estimated that there was only 69 individuals left in the wild. So today there's an estimated 34,000 individuals in North America. So this is another great example of conservation at work using reintroduction programs, habitat conservation efforts, and a ban on hunting altogether to help a species. So there are still a few present day threats, which are lead poisoning, loss of wintering habitat, and then sometimes where the mute swan and the trumpeter swans overlap in southern Canada, the mute swans can be a problem for them as well. So here's a range map for the trumpeter swans, which are definitely more common out west. So most of the Alaskan and Canadian flocks are migratory, whereas most of the southern US flocks are sedentary or very short distance migrants. And the patterns of migration for each flock is really diverse. So if you see a trumpeter swan and you see a egg on its wing, it's a really useful thing to report because it helps estimate their survival rate and population sizes. So if you see one, you can just Google, reporting a bird band, or you can go to USGS Bird Banding Laboratory. All you need to know for the trumpeter swan is the color of the wing tag and the color of the lettering. And it's even helpful to report the same bird over and over again so that you can give information about how long that bird is staying in a specific spot. And the next one is a Buick Swan, and this one will be quick. The Buick Swan and the Tundra Swan are sometimes split into two different species and sometimes considered the same species, where the Buick is the Eurasian race and the Tundra Swan is the American race. So Buick Swans are distinguished by a really large yellow patch on their face. And this is their range. They breed in Siberia and spend their winter in Western Europe and the UK. However, there have been a few rare observations of them in North America, and there's actually a famous wintering population in Japan that a lot of people go visit. And now we've made it to Tundra Swans. That's what you all came to learn about. So the Tundra Swan is the smallest of the 3 swan species, and it's the most numerous in North America. It was first dubbed as the whistling swan by Lewis of Lewis and Clark because of the whistling sound that their wings make. And it's still actually called that a lot today. This is kind of a neat picture that I took in Long Point at the beginning of March. Because it shows 3 different molting stages. So it's a good comparison for ID. The adult on the right-hand side shows an all-white swan with the yellow lores. There we go. Right there, that is very characteristic for Tundra Swans. So when you see this marking, you know it's a Tundra Swan. And then the other 2 swans are both less than a year old, but at different stages of molting. So they were both born the summer before in the Arctic, and they're slowly getting rid of most of their gray juvenile feathers. Also, notice their beak color. The swan in the center still has a pink beak, while the one on the left has, it's all turned black. But by April, the 2 on the left should look the same, but they might still have a little bit of gray feathers on their head and neck. So here's just a quick close-up of the juvenile. Okay, and then here's the comparison between Tundra and Trumpeter Swans. Their ranges didn't used to overlap, but with the Trumpeter Swans expanding near the Great Lakes, we sometimes get this fun ID challenge. And so I just like to preface this with that it's really sometimes very hard to tell apart Trumpeter and Tundra Swans, especially from far away. So don't be intimidated by this or think that you always have to make the right decision. If you're making a checklist, you can also always say probable Trumpeter Swan, because sometimes you just can't tell. It's tough. However, there are some differences that I'll show you here. So one way to tell them apart is size, if they're standing right next to each other. Tundra Swans are anywhere from 6 to 7 kilograms, where, like I said, Trumpeter Swans can be 9 to 12 kilos. So if you see a flock of Tundra Swans with 1 or 2 like really huge swans, it's a pretty good indicator that you're looking at a Trumpeter Swan. But sometimes size can be tough if they're not standing right next to each other. Just gonna take some more. So if you are a bit closer and you can see this detail, then you compare their heads. So first you can look at the size and shape of the bill, which is longer and straighter on the Trumpeter Swan and has a more concave slope on the Tundra Swan. Also, the slope of the forehead and the bill on a Trumpeter Swan is kind of the same. And whereas on a Tundra Swan, it's kind of more of a transition. Another difference is the border between the bill and the forehead. On the Trumpeter Swan, it is a sharp V shape, and then it is more rounded on the Tundra Swan. And then another thing that I've heard is that the eye is more distinct and separate from the bill on the Tundra Swan. And the last two tricks are good, and they're easy to see when you're looking at a close-up illustration, but sometimes they are a little bit hard to see in the field. So the best difference is the yellow dot on the Tundra Swan. If you see that, you can be sure it's a Tundra Swan. However, nothing is 100%, of course. And like shown in this drawing, they don't actually always have that yellow dot there. So about 10% of Tundra Swans don't have the yellow lures right around here. And then I think my favorite part about Tundra Swans is their sound. So when they show up in the spring, you know, it sounds like they're cheering someone on or something. And if there's a whole bunch of them in a flock at night, it kind of sounds like they're, you know, almost enjoying a party together or something. So I thought I would play you a Tundra Swan sound. I'm not sure if it's going to work, but I'll try. I'll turn my phone up really loud. This is from the Sibley's app where I took these photos from as well. It's a really great birding app. Okay, let me play it. So that was a Tundra Swan, and I'll quickly play a Trumpeter Swan sound so you can compare. I hope that's coming through, but so it sounds more like a trumpet, hence the name. So hopefully that helped out. Oh yeah, so I'll just mention the app. The Sibley's app that I use is great. It does cost some money, and also there's a Merlin app that if you're just starting out, it's free. So check that out if you'd like. There's lots of sounds and maps and ID tricks, so it's great. So here's a really good example of the yellow lure. I think you can see it better on the face of the Tundra Swan. And a few random facts about Tundra Swans. They find mates by the time they're 2 or 3, and they stay with these mates permanently. And so once a pair forms, they do kind of everything together all year, including feeding and roosting. And based on banding records, the oldest known Tundra Swan was a female, and it was banded and found 23 years and 7 months later in Ohio. Some threats to Tundra Swans include lead poisoning by shotgun cartridges and other pollution. Avian cholera and nematode are a few diseases that sometimes do kill Tundra Swans. And oil and gas drilling in the Arctic, which is their breeding habitats, and loss of wetlands on their resting sites towards the Arctic are all potential threats to Tundra Swans. So now I'll play this video for you a few times, which are the yearly movements of Tundra Swans. So it starts in January, where they're divided into 2 populations, as you can see here. The eastern population is mainly in the Chesapeake Bay and a little bit along the Atlantic coast, and the western population in California. So I'll just play this. And by March 1st, more are spreading out to their stopover spots around the Great Lakes, which really explodes during March. And then during April and May, they're flying across the prairies where there are more very important stopover spots for them. By early June, they're at their breeding grounds in the Arctic tundra, and they stay until the end of August, when some start migrating back again after breeding. By October, most are on the move back through the prairies, and most are back at the wintering grounds by mid-December, and then it kind of starts all over again. I'll let that play one more time. This is all citizen science data taken from eBird. Okay, And this is just kind of like a more simplistic look at the Tundra Swans range. So the wintering is the blue, the migration route is the yellow, and where they breed is the orange at the top. And then these are all the IBAs that are designated specifically for Tundra Swans. So it gives you a pretty good picture of where they go. So looking at the ones at the top, sorry about my scribbles there, but those are the ones where they breed at. And then the polygon at the bottom are all the stopover sites that are so important for them so that they can reach their breeding grounds. And one more map, another interesting point to point out here. This is a map from the Swans of the World book that was published in 1974. And I want to point out the resting spots. So in the map shown here, there's a few resting spots along Lake Erie, the Lake Erie shores. And if you remember the videos, I just took a screenshot here. You can see that this is more modern, or this is more up-to-date data. You can see that the entire southwestern Ontario has concentrated numbers of Tundra Swans in mid-March. So in the past, they would spend longer at these Lake Erie hotspots, but now that there's more modern and efficient harvesting techniques, not as much crop is left over for them, so they kind of disperse or use a larger area or move on quicker to other agricultural areas. So now they can stop at other spots like Long Point, Aylmer Wildlife Management Area, Rondeau, and Thetford Flats, which is, like I said, right outside the museum there. So now I'm just going to go through a quick kind of year-long annual cycle of what a Tundra Swan would be doing all year. So I'll start at the wintering grounds. The eastern population, which is estimated to be around 60,000, spend their winter along part of the Atlantic coast, mainly in the Chesapeake Bay. However, some swans are actually now overwintering in more northern areas like Long Point, where this year around 1,000 swans actually stayed the whole winter. And during the winter, they eat mollusks, mussels, clams, and also leftover crops in fields. And an interesting thing that happens in the winter is that often gulls like the ring-billed gull and the herring gull will swoop down and knock clams right out of the swan's mouth and take their food. So, you know, they don't have any fries in the winter, I guess. I'm not sure. So yeah, before they leave their wintering grounds, they're their lowest adult weight. So they actually need these stopover points on the way to gain weight on the way to breeding. So Tundra Swans take their time with this migration, which can take up to a few months. This is so they can, again, fatten up on their way to the Arctic. And they also don't want to arrive too early because it would still be very, very cold in the Arctic before summer. The birds that migrate through this part of the Great Lakes arrive after the first warm spells, usually from late February to late March, and it's kind of seems like it's getting earlier lately. And then there'll be a few days with really concentrated numbers, and they can move on pretty quickly. So this first push can be missed if you're not kind of watching and you don't take the opportunity to just go out when you see them. So this year, the biggest concentrations have unfortunately already passed through. But there still could be smaller pushes of them stopping over. So keep your eyes out peeled. And during this time, it seems like they kind of stay in the middle of the field. So they, take the good spots where they can see predators coming and stay safe. And they're the bigger birds that are here during the winter or during the migration. So the smaller ones like the geese and the ducks and the sandhill cranes, they kind of get the less safe spots of the edges. That's what I kind of see. So once they get to their breeding grounds, which is the Canadian Arctic tundra and Alaska, they eat seeds, stems, roots, and tubers of plants. And this is the only time of year when they aren't in huge social flocks, although there are some smaller flocks of non-breeding swans. So then the breeding ones start to make their nests, which are near water. and placed in wet meadow tundra or on edges between ponds. And both the male and the female build the nest from vegetation that's available in the tundra, like grasses and lichens. And the cone-shaped nest is around 8 inches high and 20 inches wide, and it's finished about a week before they start laying eggs. This is also the only time of the year when they really mostly sleep on land. And the same pair will often come back to the same nest year after year. Then they lay eggs, and the cream-colored eggs that are shown here are around 10 centimeters long and 6.5 centimeters wide. And usually there's 3 to 5 eggs on the nest, which the female will incubate for around 30 days, while the male kind of guards the territory around the nest. So if the nest is predated or otherwise destroyed, they actually won't try to nest. They won't try to lay another clutch, it's called, which a lot of other birds do because they have time in the season. So hatchlings, which are called cygnets, hatch early in July, and they're precocial, which means they're born completely covered in down. They're able to see, and they can walk basically right off the nest pretty quickly. So in a day or so for tundra swans, the cygnets are walking around. They're able to feed almost right away with a little bit of help from their parents for a few weeks. And this picture here is actually not tundra swan cygnets. They're hard to find pictures of because they breed so far north, but I couldn't not include like a cute tundra swan or a cute swan baby photo. So the tundra swans would look mostly like this, but they have more pink bills. So by 9 to 10 weeks, they get rid of their downy feathers and they grow their juvenile feathers. And these juvenile feathers are brownish gray and darkest on their head and neck. By around 11 weeks, they actually already have the ability to fly. So cold and starvation does kill a lot of the young, but if they survive their first year, they can live really long lives. So before migrating, the adults molt and are unable to fly for several weeks until new wing feathers grow. This is called a catastrophic molt because they lose all of their feathers at once. And it's kind of crazy to imagine what that might look like in a flock of, you know, a few thousand of them on the tundra, losing all of these huge feathers all at once. It's, you know, it might look like it snowed again in the Arctic or something in the summer. So an interesting comparison is that ducks also have catastrophic molt, and they change to their drab colors for camouflage, but swans don't really change their colors at all when they molt. So this might be because they don't have too many predators as adults. Another interesting fact about the feather colors is that most white birds you see, like snow geese or pelicans, have black wingtips. So the melanin in this darker feathers or the tips strengthens the feathers and makes it more resistant to parasites. But since swans breed in the Arctic and they have colder, more open environments, they have a less chance of getting these parasites. So they don't have the black wingtips. And then one more cool thing about tundra swans before I move on is that they have the most feathers of any flying bird. So someone actually counted out 25,000 feathers on a tundra swan, mostly on its head and neck. So it kind of makes sense why they fly all the way up to the Arctic for the summer to keep cool with 25,000 feathers on them. So the post-breeding migration, this is a faster migration than in the spring with shorter stopover times, but they take more or less the same route on the way back to their eastern or western wintering grounds. So unlike songbirds, the cygnets will stay with their parents until the next breeding season, so a whole year, and they will all migrate together. So overall, the most extreme migrants will travel 6,000 kilometers between the Arctic and the eastern coast twice a year, which is pretty crazy if you think about it. So that means that here in southern Ontario, it doesn't seem like they're migrating too far, but they're already coming from way up in the Arctic and moving on to the Atlantic coast. So that means when we see them here, they've already flown around 5,000 kilometers and still have farther to go. So that's kind of it for their annual cycle. And so wrapping up, I'd just like to re-emphasize the importance of these stopover breeding and wintering spots for each part of the Tundra Swan's life cycle. And conservation of these habitats, including wetlands, agriculture, and tundra, are really important for them and for other species as well. So I just want to close by saying that, you know, if you're in Southern Ontario and you haven't gone out to watch this amazing migration, then you should definitely try this year for the tail end of it, or start looking out for them regularly next February. And you might just catch the peak of, you know, tens of thousands of tundra swans passing through, which is actually really quite magical. So I hope you can catch that. And I hope you learned a little bit about tundra swans and IBAs. Again, thank you so much for having me. Here's my contact info if you would like to email me any questions, and a few resources that I used for the presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Amanda.
So that's the end of Amanda's presentation. I will take some questions in the Q&A now if I can help anyone. Otherwise, that is Amanda's contact email if you would like to get in touch with her. Let's see. I know we had a question in the chat about how you go about counting 33,000 swans, and I'm by no means the expert that Amanda is, but I know that one technique is to try and count how many swans there would be in a small focused area, and then sort of project how many of that amount would be spread out. So if you kind of get an idea of how much space is occupied by 50 swans, then you know, how many spaces hold 50 swans, and you can kind of extrapolate that way. But every time I've tried that, I've found it very difficult myself. Let's see. Yes, and the presentation will be posted up on the Lambton Heritage Museum website on our YouTube channel. And I think for everyone who registered for the talk, you'll also be emailed a link once it's been uploaded as well. We don't have someone asked whether or not there's a trail behind the Lambton Museum to see the swans. There isn't specifically a trail, but the Greenway Road is just north of the museum. And that's often where we see a lot of the swans. It's just the road north of the museum. It's really close. It's about a 5-minute drive from the museum. Let's see, have I missed anyone's questions? Okay, so I think I'm mostly caught up. If anyone has any questions, we have a few minutes. Otherwise, again, I can just post Amanda's email in the chat in case you need to get, if you have a question for Amanda rather than me. Her email is abichel@birdscanada.org. In terms of actually seeing the swans, we've had very small numbers the last few days. So I think maybe the majority of them have already come through, or at least the largest group of them has come through for this year. They didn't stay very long, and there weren't as many all at once as there were last year. But so it's kind of disappointing. I was hoping for more, but it always just depends on the birds. So I guess thanks everyone for listening in and contributing your questions. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19 restrictions, the Lambton Heritage Museum is still closed to the public, but there is, as always, we have lots of Tundra Swan information on our website, www.returnoftheswans.com, and we do update a swan migration calendar there. So when we do see swans, that is updated. And as I said, this presentation will also be available on our website. Well, it looks like there's maybe more questions, or, oh, is there protection against the use of pesticides? Yeah, so there was a question about whether or not people can use pesticides in the Thetford bog, and I don't know the answer to that question. As far as I know, there's not any specific protection. Are there any predators for the swans in Ontario? I think animals like coyotes would be a predator. I think the swans do tend to spend their nights out on the lake or on large bodies of water, and I think that is kind of to keep themselves safer. Someone's asked about the link to register for the disaster webinar. It will probably either be on the Lambton Heritage Museum's website or on the Heritage Sarnia Lambton website. Do the wind turbines interfere with the flying of the swans? Not that I know of in particularly. Well, I guess if that's all the questions for tonight, we'll close. But again, thanks everyone for joining me. Unfortunately, it's too bad Amanda couldn't be here in person. She really wanted to be, but I'm glad anyone stayed around and had a good time. Thank you.